Bulk fermentation is the trickiest part of the sourdough bread making process. When I first started making sourdough, I chronically under-fermented my bread, which is a very common beginner mistake. We get impatient, we worry about overproofing, and we shape our dough too soon. I also, at this point, get hundreds of messages on social media platforms every single day, and most of the issues that people come to me with are a result of bulk fermentation troubles. Dough that's too sticky, dough that's gummy on the inside after it's baked, flat loaves, really big holes surrounded by denser areas, cracking in the scoring, super pale exteriors on the loaf, dense loaves, very heavy loaves. All of these things are bulk fermentation issues. There's a lot of nuance when it comes to sourdough, so there definitely could be some other variables in there, but by and large, bulk fermentation is the thing that we need to nail in order to have wonderful sourdough bread. Here are my top 12 tips to nailing the bulk fermentation for your best loaf yet. So number one is your dough temperature directly impacts how long your bulk fermentation will take. 80-degree dough will finish its bulk fermentation in my house between 4 to 5 hours, whereas 65-degree dough might take 15 hours or more. When it comes to temperature variations, it's not just a minor thing, it is a massive difference. So when you read a recipe and it gives you a time frame for how long to let your dough sit out, such as 8 hours, take that with a grain of salt, because the temperature of the author's dough might not be the same as your dough, and if the temperatures are wildly different, your results are not going to be the same. Number two, try to control your dough temperature to get a more predictable bulk fermentation timeline. My sourdough journey personally completely transformed when I started doing this. These days, I use the temperature of my water that I add to my dough, which I make sure that it's very warm, and after I mix my dough, I put my dough in a very warm place, which is my oven with a cup of boiling water in it to keep it nice and toasty. And that ensures that my dough temperature pretty much the entire time is between 78 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. If I can keep my dough at this temperature, I know that pretty much every time that I do this, it takes 4 to 5 hours for my dough to finish the bulk fermentation. And there's a lot less guessing about how long things take. The more that you do things in the exact same way every single time, the more predictable your bread results will be. That's why a lot of people keep a notebook and take notes on different things that they do with their bakes, because then they can pinpoint the differences between what they did and how that impacted their final loaf. You might not be that analytical of a person, I certainly am not, but little things like that can help you improve if you're really taking your bread making seriously and want to get that perfect loaf. Tip number 3, check out the Sourdough Journey's bulk fermentation chart. This is a dough temperature and percentage rise chart. So when I talked about how important dough temperature is, some people will say, okay, but how do I know when to cut off the bulk fermentation based on my dough temperature? And this chart is a great place to start. Tom from the Sourdough Journey did tons of tests in a controlled environment at different dough temperatures to figure out when to cut off bulk fermentation. And the easiest way to do this is to use a bowl or some kind of vessel with milliliter markings on the side. That way you can see how much your dough is rising, and his chart lets you know exactly how far it should rise before you cut it off, and it's completely dependent on your dough's temperature. So for example, if you have dough that is 80 degrees, Tom has figured out that it should rise by about 30%. So if your dough in your bowl is at 1,000 milliliters, and it's 80 degrees, once it rises up to 1,300 milliliters, which is a 30% rise, you would shape your dough and cut the bulk fermentation off. He has this guide for every dough temperature, and he has a new and improved version of this resource as of the end of 2024 that has every degree. It used to just go in 5-degree increments, but now it's even more detailed, so you can totally nail your bulk fermentation in this way. The reason this chart is so useful is because different dough temperatures need to be cut off at different times, because most of us are doing an overnight cold proof in the fridge. This has lots of benefits to it. It is optional. You could do your second proof on the countertop, but the fridge really is ideal. And when you put your dough in the fridge, it's still rising until it cools down to the fridge temperature. And at that point, it's still fermenting, but it's like at a snail's pace. But if you put 80-degree dough in the fridge, it doesn't automatically go down to whatever your fridge temperature is, say 38, 39 degrees. It's slowly decreasing in temperature, and as it's decreasing in temperature, it's still rising. Warmer dough is going to rise more than cooler dough because it's simply going into the fridge at a higher temperature, which is going to ferment at a faster pace than cooler dough. That's the thought process behind cutting off the bulk fermentation at different percentage rises. Tip number 4 is a follow-up to this, which is check out the Aliquot Method charts from Crusty Cravings by Hannah. The Aliquot Method in general is very simple. Aliquot just means a small portion of something. So the idea is you take a small portion of your dough and put it in some kind of vessel. This allows you to track the percentage rise of your dough in a smaller environment, because with a big bowl, sometimes it's hard to get the dough even on top, and it just is a little bit trickier with a big massive dough. But if you can put it in a small vessel with milliliter markings on the side, it's a lot just easier and less messy to track. Now you could use like a shot glass with milliliter markings on the side. There are cool like tubes that some people have created for this purpose. But Audrey, which her handle is Artisan Sourdough Baker on TikTok, she popularized the method of using a little Jello shot cup to make this very, very easy. The original idea that got very popular is to take a Jello shot cup and put 40 grams of your dough in there. And once your dough reaches the top of the lid and is almost trying to pop off the lid, then your dough is finished. However, a Jello shot cup fits about 60 grams of dough. So if you're putting 40 grams in, that would be a 30% rise. And as we talked about earlier, a 30% rise is what you want for 80-degree dough. So how do you make this method work for you if your dough is, say, 70 degrees or 75 degrees? Well, Crusty Cravings by Hannah figured this out for all of us and created a chart with different dough temperatures telling us how much dough we need to put in there before it rises to the top and we know it's finished. As an example, 65-degree dough, you would want to put 28 grams of dough in your little Jello shot cup, and once it reaches the top, it's ready to shape. Another example is 70-degree dough should have 32 grams of dough put into it, and then once it reaches the top, it's ready to shape. Her charts make it simple to use this method with the little cheap Jello shot cup, but you can adjust it based on your individual dough's temperature. Tip number 5. The amount of starter that you put in your dough will impact how quickly or slowly your dough ferments. If I want my dough to ferment pretty quickly, I might do 25% starter in my recipe. As an example, if I'm making 2 loaves of bread, that's 1,000 grams of bread flour, and I would be using 250 grams of active starter. If I want my dough to really slow down, which is helpful for a longer, say overnight bulk fermentation, I will cut down the amount of starter in my dough to 5 to 10%. So as an example, if I'm doing 1,000 grams of bread flour, I would only be using like 100 grams of starter, which would be 10%, or maybe even 50 grams of starter, which would only be 5%. This is useful if you have a warmer home, but still want to be able to do an overnight bulk fermentation. Simply adjust how much starter you're putting in your dough. The less starter you have, the longer it will take those microbes to eat through the flour and the water that you've provided. While you can use this to your advantage to adjust recipes to allow it to work better for your timing, it's also great for troubleshooting. If your dough seems to be over fermenting every single time, consider decreasing the amount of starter that you put in your dough and see if it gets a little bit better next time. Tip number 6, the dough will have lots of bubbles all around the surface and especially the sides and bottom of the bowl. This is why I like to use a glass bowl, because it makes it a lot easier to tell that there are tons of bubbles. If you use a stainless steel bowl or like a ceramic bowl, which are gorgeous, it just makes it more difficult to get that visual cue. Tip number 7, I find that the stickiness of the surface of your dough is a great indicator of where we're at in the bulk fermentation. When you first mix your dough, it'll be very shaggy and it will be quite sticky. Obviously, after you mix your dough, your hands will be completely covered in sticky dough. But as we do the stretch and folds or the coil folds, the dough gets smoother and smoother and smoother. It'll still be pretty sticky during those stretch and folds and coil folds, but at some point, it will start shifting into more of a tacky surface and maybe even completely smooth. I can take a dry finger and touch the surface of my dough when the bulk fermentation is done, and it does not stick at all. This does depend on the hydration of your dough. My typical sourdough bread recipe is between 68 and 72% hydration, and this trick works perfectly for me every single time. However, if you're working with a higher hydration dough, say 80% hydration or higher, your dough's pretty much always going to be sticky, even when the bulk fermentation is perfectly done. So just keep that in mind as a little side note. Tip number 8, the dough will be slightly domed on the edge where it meets the bowl. When you look at the dough as it's bulk fermenting, towards the end, it will be kind of curved like this. And the dough will meet the bowl and then it'll kind of curve up in the middle. And that dome is a great indicator to knowing when the bulk fermentation is somewhere near completed. Tip number 9, if the dough is willing to pull away from the side of the bowl, I have found that to be a great indicator that the bulk fermentation is nearing its completion. The bowl material can play a part in this. As an example, a plastic container like a Cambro container, my dough usually has a harder time separating from. Also, metal bowls tend to cling onto the dough a bit more. That's another reason why I love glass bowls. But if you kind of tug at the side of the dough where it meets the bowl, it should be willing to separate from the bowl instead of clinging on for dear life. And especially if you're using a glass bowl, you can tilt your bowl up, and if the dough starts sliding out, like it's willing to slide out and not stick to the side of the bowl, that's a great indicator that the bulk fermentation is finished. A lot of people take this a little too seriously and say, oh, if my dough is not just sliding or quickly dumping right out of my bowl, then it must not be done. And that's not necessarily the case. I would take it as just one visual cue. If everything else is lining up, but your dough is just not sliding out of the bowl, still move forward. Remember, all of these things are taken into consideration together. None of them just stand on their own by themselves. Tip number 10, tap or kind of shake your bowl from side to side. And if your dough is very jiggly, that's a great sign that your bulk fermentation is progressing nicely. We want our dough to be super jiggly. It's an indication that it's nicely aerated. It's gonna have that cloudy texture. Basically, the carbon dioxide that the yeast has produced is filling up the gluten. And as that happens, our dough is rising, and once it rises nicely, it's gonna have a jiggle to it, and that's a beautiful thing. Tip number 11, try the poke test. In Karen Newman's book, Sourdough by Science, which I have learned a lot from, she talks about using the poke test as an indicator to see if the bulk fermentation is somewhere near finished. I'd like to just read what she says about this to make sure that I don't butcher any of her words. Eventually, your dough will have risen, and you'll want to know if it's ready. Ready means it has enough gas and it has a strong gluten network to hold the gas in the dough through baking. There's also a stage way past ready called over-fermented, in which the yeast has eaten all of the food in the dough and will no longer be able to make new gas, and the bacteria in the dough have decided to eat the gluten network. You can see that this would be bad. No gas, no gluten network, no puffy bread. The poke test can help you figure out if your dough is ready and if it's in danger of becoming over-fermented anytime soon. I find this test is also useful in assessing whether a loaf is ready to bake. A caveat, the poke test is not as useful in whole grain doughs and should never be used on refrigerated dough, which is too cold and stiff to spring back. So here is how you do the poke test. She says to poke a wet finger. I actually like doing a floured finger. I think either one works perfectly fine. So poke your finger into the dough for 1 second. Remove your finger and look for one of 3 things. If it springs back quickly, it's not fully fermented yet. Let it go longer. If a hole stays there and doesn't spring back at all, it's overproofed. Quickly shape it and move on. If the hole starts to spring back slowly, perhaps even not completely, it's likely ready. And tip number 12, after the pre-shaping, your dough will have lots of bubbles on the surface. Pre-shaping is probably my favorite part of the entire sourdough bread process. It is such a transformative moment where you have this blob of dough that just gets beautifully shaped into this taut round ball. And as you're creating surface tension, bubbles start to peek out on the surface, and it's just a beautiful thing. But if you do the pre-shaping and there are no bubbles popping out onto the surface and it's just smooth, I have a hard time thinking that your bread is fully fermented. So if this happens, don't panic. You can pivot in this situation, continue with the final shaping, put it in your banneton, cover it, and let it sit on your counter for longer before you put it in the fridge. This additional rise time will help your dough finish the fermentation before you put it in the fridge overnight, and it's a good way to salvage your bread. So those are all of my favorite bulk fermentation tips. I hope something in here stuck out that helps you. Sourdough is kind of a slow burn of knowledge, and while I hope these tips are useful, the best thing that you can do is just start making bread. The more trial and error you have with bulk fermentation, and especially being able to read a crumb, you're gonna get a lot better at figuring out the timing of things. And especially if you use the same recipe over and over and over again, trying to keep as many variables consistent as you can, you're gonna start getting better results each and every time. Let me know in the comments what your favorite bulk fermentation tip is, and let's all learn from each other.